So let's talk about narcissism. Oh no, not narcissism again. Okay, I'm not talking about the people which can be bullies or self-centered. I'm talking about NPD. It is a very real condition. In the same way that some people have schizophrenia, some people are bipolar. And one of the things that you have to understand is that this person, when they were a child, went through the most horrific trauma. Now, lots of us have gone through trauma, right? But this person went through trauma that can be all different types of abuse. And because it was so intense, they had to create a fantasy world. So at 4 years old, they'd run out into the garden. Oh, my nose is itching, money's coming. They would run out into the garden and pretend that they were a wizard. Or they would climb up into a tree and pretend that they were Spider-Man. They started to learn how to create fake realities. And as they grew older, this did not change because the trauma was so bad that just to think of it would make them quiver, would make their heart pound, so it was blocked. So what happened was they started to live in a fake reality. Now, this video is particularly for those which have broken up or disengaged with a person who has NPD. And this can be family, this can be relationship, this can be anybody. It can be the boss that you're working with. But when you try and communicate, because they have this fantasy world. Now, when you were in the relationship, whatever the relationship was, as long as you were bonded in that fake reality, as long as you surrendered all your boundaries, everything you believed in, and you joined in with their version of life, you were okay. You were good. But when you started to question it, or when you started to see behavior that you didn't like, or when you started to see lies, or you had accusations thrown at you that were so ludicrous, you started to have these boundaries and go, hang on a minute, and you probably stood up for yourself. You might have raged, you might have shouted, you might have isolated and laid on your bed for 3 days because you couldn't figure out what was going on. And what was going on was you were no longer worshipping the cult of one. You were no longer fitting into this fake fantasy reality. Now, post the relationship, you might try and communicate with this person. It can be an ex concerning the children. It could be a parental figure about healing the wounds. If you are not fitting into their version of reality, anything you say comes in, gets translated by the and gets viewed to attack. And this is why it can be so confusing, because you can be talking really nice, really kind, sensible points of view, and what you get back can be horrific. Sometimes it doesn't even make sense. And they either fight or they can fawn, which means they become the victim. And if you go back over their text, you will indeed see this. And I just learned this from Richard Grannon, and it's so true. You'll see fawn. Oh, but I've had this happen, and oh, I haven't been able to buy electricity, and oh, but my life is just going so bad. And then the next minute they're like, but you're such a cow, and do you realize who you are and how everybody views you? And suddenly they're in attack mode. And then suddenly they go back into the victim mode, the poor me. So it's fight or it's fawn. And this can be really frustrating. And eventually you have to realize there is just no way, unless you fit into their fantasy reality, which can be very grandiose. I mean, they can see themselves as this top-notch business person. They can imagine that they are a doctor or a psychiatrist, or they can imagine anything they want to, because they create these fantasy realities so that they can cope with life. I mean, they will They will face really difficult situations. It can be the death of someone, and they'll literally walk over the body and carry on with their life as though it never happened, because they lock things like that away. So my advice to you is, you can try and communicate, but don't take it personally when the responses that you get are very volatile or don't even make sense. It's because you are living in the real world and they are living in a fantasy-based world that can change at any moment. One minute they can be into gardening, the next minute they're into medical, the next minute they love cats, the next minute it's monkeys, the next minute it's growing their own food. They just change. And you're left going, who did I know? Well, the person that you knew was the person whose reality you fitted into, because right at the beginning of meeting them, they sold you this idea. They sold you this plan. I mean, the idea that I was sold was this person wanted a family, they wanted to help children, they wanted unity and loyalty, and I just fed into that. I didn't realize that that was just a fantasy they created, and it wasn't what they actually wanted, and it can become very toxic. So I hope that explains why it's absolutely impossible to communicate with somebody who has NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, because they live in an absolute fake and false reality. And because you are grounded and living in a very real reality, and you won't buy into the fake reality, anything you say is not going to be translated in the right way. It's going to be translated from a place of fear, from a place of vengeance, from a place of protecting themselves, because they will never take accountability. And they cannot even go to therapy for this. They can't, because they will not be able to turn inwards and take accountability for their own behavior. I hope this helps.